Hi, I'm Sherry Boodram, CEO of CannDelta, North America's #1 cannabis consulting firm, here to guide you as always through the intricacies of compliance for Canadian cannabis cultivators and processors. Joining us today is Rob Perry from GrowerIQ, and together we'll tackle the challenges faced by cannabis businesses, offering clear, actionable solutions to help you stay ahead. From navigating audits to implementing best practices, our focus is on empowering your operation with the knowledge and strategies for success.
Hi, I'm Rob Perry from GrowerIQ. Thank you, Sherry. GrowerIQ is a complete cannabis production management platform. Ours is the first platform to integrate your facility systems, including sensors, building controls, QMS, and ERP into a single simplified interface. GrowerIQ is changing the way producers use software, transforming a regulatory requirement into a robust platform to learn, analyze, and improve performance. GrowerIQ and its subsidiaries have been supporting the cannabis community since 2014. It is active in facilities and governments in over 15 countries.
Okay, Rob, let's jump right in. What is cannabis software?
It's a really good question. Cannabis software is really the brain of any cannabis production facility. It amalgamates all the data, all the reports, all the activities that have occurred within the facility into one central database that can then be easily exported into readable and usable reports, sensible information, graphs that can be accessed by the appropriate members in the facility. Typically, cannabis platforms are built on three principles. One of them is transparency, so giving everybody in the company eyes into what's going on. Quality, not only quality products, but also quality systems. And efficiency as well, being able to cut down on general paperwork and administrative activity.
That's great. I've worked for many years in government. I've worked at Health Canada for 8 years altogether. And within that time, I was a senior compliance and enforcement officer in the Controlled Substances program and in Health Canada's medical cannabis program very early on when the industry just started. And there were a lot of challenges with license holders starting into a new industry and really just trying to understand, how do they comply? How do they do all this record keeping? And it is a lot of paperwork. Even in my role now as a CEO of CannDelta, we still support our clients with audits. We'll go out and help them understand how an audit is run, actually conduct an audit so that they are better prepared when they are visited by Health Canada. And again, they still kind of run into this issue of, how do you manage all that data? And it is very onerous sometimes. And I could see how software can be very useful for that compared to an electronic system, a different electronic system, such as, using Excel sheets. And the way the regulations are set up, you don't necessarily, they're not necessarily saying that you have to use software. You can use spreadsheets. But in actual practice, it's very challenging to manage spreadsheets. Right?
Absolutely.
And that's something that the software can really allow license holders to really get a handle on their operation. So I guess, thinking of that, what are some ways that, in your experience, working with license holders, that you find that they can really take that software and implement it into their facility? What does that onboarding look like for them? What are some of the questions that they might think of when they're transitioning from, maybe a paper-based system or spreadsheets into something that's more a robust software?
It's a really good question, Sherry. Yeah, there are a few things to consider when implementing a seed-to-sale platform or cannabis software, right? And the first one is, where is that company starting from? Is it a new company that's just starting up where, they have a clean slate, there's no data existing already, they're still putting their SOPs together, and it's very easy to work a seed-to-sale platform into a structure like that. So an implementation timeline and implementation project can be pretty short in that scenario. For a company that's been around for a while, and as you say, has, they have a lot of paper, they have a long history of data, it takes a bit more of a bespoke approach. It makes sense to sit down with that company, look at the data that they have, look at what some of their processes are, and then try to map that through to the software. So there's a bit of a change management element to it as well, and an implementation with a company like this can move as quickly or as gently as is required or as is desired. And there's a third scenario as well, and that's a facility that's switching from another software provider, and this again is a little bit bespoke. It depends on the software provider they're using. Maybe they've been running into issues with that provider, and it makes sense to sit down and again run through a bit of a change management process as we migrate them on to a new software system. But ultimately, timelines can come down to, we've done it extremely quickly. I mean, we're talking under a week where there was an absolute necessity for it. And then there are some other groups out there, I've heard that their deployment has taken over a year. So again, it varies very much by the situation of each cannabis producer.
Right. And you said something very interesting about the necessity of it. And what I was saying previously was that Health Canada doesn't require implementing software, right, for record keeping. They give you the option of paper-based, but again, in reality, it's that it is challenging to manage paper, and some of the challenges that companies kind of face is that they think everything's going to plan. They're keeping all this inventory records, and they understand to the best of their knowledge where all of the inventory is at a given time. But when Health Canada shows up for an audit, they might recognize that, oh, actually, I don't really know where it is really in this real time. I know where we put it last night, but where is it really today? Like, what room is it really in at this point? And then, you kind of start seeing where the gaps are. And Health Canada does have a system where they look at the criteria of a deficiency such as that. And Health Canada looks at, many different deficiencies when they come into a facility to do an audit. They'll look at compliance to all the requirements depending on what type of audit that they're conducting. But record keeping is an area where license holders look for other solutions to try to manage that, right, and to be able to respond to the observations. And in an observation response, they'll try to come up with solutions such as, okay, maybe we use something that's paper-based, but we need to find something that's more robust, and then they'll start looking at a software. So I think that's a great way for software companies to show that there is some real utility in strengthening compliance.
Absolutely, and I just say, if you know anybody that has a Health Canada audit coming up next week, please don't give your software company a call at that point, right? It's something you want to get a little bit of lead time in, a little bit of runway, so that things can shift over that way. But yeah, we hear a lot from companies coming out of Health Canada audits. They realize that, just as you're saying, that maybe their paper-based system is becoming, it's growing over the years, it's become a little bit more unwieldy, and it's time to get a little bit more structure in. Or the other driver we see a lot of the time is really business-based, right? And it's, CFO is pushing a drive for efficiency, working on those margins, and it's really a financial decision to move to a cannabis software program.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think sometimes too, when a company now gets started, they get their license, that it's not always clear to them how the inspections are structured, what the auditor is actually looking for, even though they know that certain, they know that they need to meet the requirements of the regulations, but they don't necessarily know what that means in practice. And sometimes it doesn't come to light until the actual inspection. So I guess to give shed some light on what an audit process or structure looks like, the format, Health Canada can have two different types of, general inspections in the way that they approach it, announced and then an unannounced inspection. So with an unannounced inspection, that's very common. Health Canada will just show up at the door, say, hey, we're here, we're going to conduct an inspection today. and then everything at the operation stops, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone stops what they're doing. All the key people come into a boardroom, meet with Health Canada, and the Health Canada auditor will then kind of run through the day. So they'll start with an introductory meeting where they'll go through things like, very common things like, what is your business model? Let's verify your license. Who are the key people? Have there been any changes? And then they will then go through the agenda. So the agenda starts with that very introductory meeting. Then Health Canada will go through the facility, do a walkthrough, and look for site compliance as they're doing that walkthrough, do some inventory counts. And after that, they will come back to the boardroom and then start to review documents. And the documents that they're looking for is usually requested in that introductory meeting so that the members of the facility can go and retrieve them in time for when the inspector comes back after the walkthrough. So then the inspector will spend hours kind of going through all the documentation. And it's very important to be able to know where the documentation is and to be able to retrieve it. And I think, again, that kind of reflects on the utility of software. So I think sometimes when you think seed to sale, it's mainly inventory tracking, but it's so much more than that. So what are some of the other elements that go into the software aside from seed to sale? Just inventory.
Absolutely. Inventory tracking is a great component of a cannabis software program. I mean, it saves days of energy and effort in terms of getting monthly reports together and submitted, but it's by no means, the exhaustive utility, as you're saying. Another really positive functionality that a lot of people have told us has come in handy in these Health Canada inspections has been the master batch record functionality.
Right.
So some software programs that are out there will actually compile all of the documentation related to a single cannabis batch, be it oils, dried flower if they're still plants, or propagated clones. It'll pull in, all the actions that have been performed on that batch. It'll pull in all the inventory, pulls in all the deviations, COAs, everything, and with a single click you can export that from the software program and then hand it over to any auditor. Which,
okay.
Definitely is a time saver if the clock is ticking.
Certainly. And I can tell you as a former inspector that being able to tell an entire story of a lot or batch is so important, right? And making that very clear that you know what happened at every single stage. You have all the documentation to support that, and you could clearly correlate that to the regulatory requirements. And that really benefits the license holder because it makes the story consistent and it puts more of the onus of the storytelling in the documentation versus asking the personnel at the site, hey, like what happened at this stage? Oh, this isn't clear. I can't see where this story connects. And then you have to go and retrieve other documents. So it's just nice having everything all in one place.
I can believe it. And what would be the overall impression of an auditor coming in where documentation isn't complete, there are kind of holes in what's being submitted? I mean, how does that color the rest of the inspection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So observations as a whole are deficiencies, right? They're deficiencies in the regulatory requirements. Health Canada categorizes deficiencies sort of in two buckets. So they have observations or deficiencies that impact the health and public safety. And then they look at how that deficiency impacts the potential for drug diversion, right? Or some fraudulent activity. So it's sort of like health and safety and then, diversion, security kind of areas. So depending on the severity of that deficiency, they'll rank it in either the observation being minor, major, or critical. Critical is if that deficiency is likely to increase the risk to health and safety or to increase the risk of diversion. A major observation is one that may increase the likelihood of diversion or the health and safety of the public. And then a minor observation, it's kind of what you expect. It's not major, it's not critical, but there's still some deficiency. So it is not really likely to cause increases to health and safety of the public or not likely to be related to or increase drug diversion or some fraudulent activity, but there's still some deficiency that needs to be addressed, right? And I would say for the most part that record keeping observations tend to sort of fall in the major minor category. You know, if you have worksheets that, or some documentation that's, you know, not signed off by QAP.
Okay.
But it typically is, but then there's like kind of one that got away. That's like a minor, right? Sort of starts to scale depending on the severity of what that document is and how critical that document is to the quality of the product or to the safety of the product. And then it kind of goes up from there. And if it happens to be something that is systemic, a systemic issue in the documentation, you know, there's reoccurrences where, you know, weeks upon weeks that certain documentation is not signed off on or not completed or not filled out, then the severity of that observation deficiency starts to increase, especially if it's an area where it has already been mentioned in a previous audit and then it's still occurring, you know, despite the response by the license holder saying that they're going to, you know, fix that concern or, you know, create some corrective action, and it's not being implemented, then it kind of goes up from there.
And what would you say would be the cause of a situation like that? Is it poorly written SOPs, failure to manage SOPs, poor training or just managerial?
It's usually a combination. Sometimes it's because, you know, there's a lack of knowledge on, you know, how to use the software. Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge of how they actually need to comply with the regulatory requirements, right? Like what is actually required to be recorded and maintained through that software. And sometimes that's not always very obvious, right? Sometimes personnel might think that, okay, like the software does this thing and they're just assuming that it automatically complies, but they don't really know how that really translates. So it's not intentional, but it happens, right? And I would say like a lot of times license holders don't intentionally try to cause a deficiency. It just kind of happens sometimes because, again, they're not trained, or there needs to be retraining, or sometimes there's, you know, newer staff that doesn't really understand, and that like ramp up of learning of, you know, what those record keeping requirements are and all of the requirements for a license holder, which is, you know, quite extensive, just to get a really good handle on that. And then other times, sometimes they don't even use software. So it's honestly a variety of things, but I would say those are the major categories for that. And again, there is ways to improve that, and it's kind of based on case by case. But those are, I would say, like the general ways that it is.
Makes sense. And in terms of, you did mention the inventory side of things during a Health Canada inspection. You know, how would during an audit, you know, how would an auditor go through this and approach the inventory?
That's a great question again. So at the beginning of the inspection, so when the auditor comes to the site, they will request a current inventory list. So they'll say, okay, like pull what you have in your inventory. And then the auditor will then randomly select lines of inventory, so in different locations, different SKUs, different, like if it's bulk or if it's a finished product. And they'll kind of select a random array of inventory that you have that's fairly representative. And then as they go through and do the walkthrough of the site, and they're usually accompanied by the QAP and other key staff who could, you know, speak to the different areas and operations of their facility, they'll walk through, and as they do the walkthrough and they go to certain areas that they have on the list, then they'll say, okay, like pull that inventory. If they're in storage, they'll say, okay, these are the SKUs or lot numbers that I've selected, let's count them. So they'll do a on-the-spot count of all the products. So it could be stored, it could be work in progress, it could be really at any stage. They have the authority to do that. And then if there are any discrepancies, then, you know, either that's found at the audit, and it still may be an observation, but really if they're looking for any discrepancies. So the inventory should always be no error, right? You can't even have one missing. If you have one missing, then that's something that needs to be, where did it go, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And when you're advising clients of yours, how do you advise them to avoid a situation like that, or prepare for it? Is it monthly counts? Is it weekly? Is it?
So having a good system in place is important. Having the SOPs in place is important, so they know like where how to move products throughout the facility in a compliant way. How is it being tracked so that everyone's aware of how that's supposed to be done, and that should be standardized. Whether or not you're scanning a QR code or manually entering something, like there has to be a consistent, uniform process and knowledge base amongst everyone on the team. So I would say that, if you're going to do that robustly, that to start a facility, I would say that, weekly counts would be fair. And then as you see a trend of, accuracy, then you could scale that back to let's say monthly, right? So, and then again, if something happens, then kind of tighten back up again and say, okay, let's do weekly again. But in actuality, it shouldn't be real time. You should know where things are. So if you feel that's not the case, you can even do daily counts. I know that's very time consuming, but at the end of the day, it's the license holder's obligation to comply with those requirements. So however they need to demonstrate that and get to a point where that can be confidently established, that's what you got to do, right? And the goal is to have something that's robust so you don't have to spend the time, doing daily counts, and you can move it to weekly or monthly. So.
And it's interesting. This is again where technology can kind of leverage things a little bit. I mean, there are some seed to sale programs out there. Ours in particular, that I know we do daily reconciliation of all the different activities, and it's surprising how often those red flags can pop up, and if people are watching, and monitoring the inventory and checking it, daily or whatever their cadence is, it's possible to catch, rectify, so that if there is a pop inspection, you're ready for it.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you just mentioned that how on your side that it's possible to sort of monitor and reconcile on a daily frequency the inventory. Can you speak a little bit to more of what that looks like on your end, and if there is a discrepancy, how you would communicate that, and if you would communicate that to the license holder?
Absolutely. So we've actually, we've created a bot to go through each of our clients' inventory on a daily basis. I think it runs at about 4 a.m. every morning, and it goes through all the transactions of the last 24-hour period, so that at 9 a.m. when our staff show up, our support teams, they get a report of all their clients to say, everything is green, all the activities look good, nothing is out of balance. If something is out of balance, they have a list of activities that occurred the day before. They can generally pinpoint it, but really they pull that list up and they call the facility and they say, in the last 24 hours, a couple things occurred. We'd suggest you take a look into it and make sure everything is good, or if something was missed.
Okay. So then can you pinpoint it to, I guess, the document that's associated with, or how is that conveyed to you?
We can pinpoint it based on the activities that occurred, right? So if one activity occurred, there was, a change in weight, or something doesn't quite balance out with what it should have moved into, it'll raise a red flag. And generally, within most cannabis software programs, there are some guardrails in terms of what you can do with your inventory, so that things aren't all over the map in terms of processing and weights and what have you. But there also has to be flexibility there too, because any system that's too strict and too prescribed, it's going to limit what a facility can do. So there's that balance really between being able to enter inventory and weights that you have to for processing, and then also setting those controls to make sure that things just don't go totally wild. And we filled in that gap, that gray area, with this daily reconciliation to make sure that everything stays on track.
Okay, that's great. And then as part of that, there's obviously some sort of threshold of acceptability that's set for certain activities. Is that set by the software company, or is that set by the license holder?
Great question. No, that's set by the license holders and their SOPs, because again, we're in 15 countries around the world. There are different regulatory authorities. There are also, even within a country, each facility has their own SOPs, their own growers, their own growing styles and processing styles, and it's we've found over the years it's very important to allow that flexibility so that facilities can do their work as they require. They can innovate as they require without some software program popping up an error message saying you can't do this.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So then as they are onboarding and setting up the software, they go through and manually set what those limits are. If it goes off, you get flagged, and I would assume that they also get flagged. Do they also receive a pop-up of being out of range?
In some scenarios they do, and then in other scenarios, especially back-end stuff, we have a team that covers it, and we're actually moving now to around-the-clock support, so full 24 hours. So if we have a grower who likes growing at 3 a.m.,
there's all kinds. So sometimes you can't sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that means that if one of the license holder, your clients, are at an inspection with Health Canada that's being conducted, and say, for example, they can't pull a report or they just don't know how to access something, they can easily call, and a support person can be there to help them.
100%. So a lot of the time, if it's a scheduled inspection, we'll have somebody on call there. It can be down at the facility with them, or remotely, depending on where the facility is located. For exactly that reason. And generally, it's not a problem, but during an audit, the pressure's on, as you were saying, the QA is taking the auditor around the facility, and maybe someone's away sick that day, and
it's always the perfect storm.
Exactly.
It's always the perfect storm.
And so a lot of the time, it's most of the time it's not a problem, but sometimes, in the panic of the moment, someone forgets how to pull a report, and that's where our team.
And I would say that most time, auditors are fairly empathetic. So, and I think they understand that, the day of the audit is just, things just don't go right. It's like you always use this document, for some reason you can't find the folder, or like the auditor just happens to select the one inventory that's happens to be somewhere else that day, or I don't know, it's always something like that. But I think that again, auditors are understanding, but we know that things kind of happen. At the end of the day, you need to be able to comply. And you said something about being able to remotely kind of dial in, and I think that's great, because really after COVID, Health Canada has moved to a lot of virtual audits. And when I was an inspector pre-COVID, we never did virtual inspections. It was always on site.
Okay.
It was always on site. So yeah, whether that's announced or unannounced, it was always on site. So there's some of the longer inspections, regular inspections, look at all of the requirements under the Act and regulations. So as you can imagine, that can be quite extensive. So sometimes it lasts longer than a day. It's usually 3 days, and you'd be on site. And then there are shorter inspections, like target inspections, that look at a specific area of the regulations. And usually the Health Canada auditor will target, kind of look at groups, GPP, good production practices. They'll look at security, and they'll look at record keeping. So they'll kind of keep it in those 3 buckets and kind of target specific areas. So one day it could be batch records, right? And they're kind of going through in depth of batch records. And it's not always in response to a complaint. Sometimes it is in response to a complaint, because they're like, okay, well, we know that there could be a compliance issue. We're going to go and target this one area and look at that one thing. Sometimes it's because they are there for another reason, and then they happen to see something else. So it really does vary, but the targeted inspections could really, serve for an opportunity to dive really deep into the different areas. So again, there's a lot of different avenues that record keeping always comes up for, right? It's kind of it's really the foundation, I think, of a lot of the areas, because whether or not you're looking at good production practices, again, there's batch records that go along with that, there's worksheets, there's SOPs, and then even with physical security, there's a lot of documentation that goes into that. I don't know the software really touches on any aspect of maintaining records as it pertains to physical security, but I guess I'm curious to know if it does.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can store all your different records on there, you know, and it acts, again, really as a central repository for all the data, all the records within the company. And you were touching on remote access, and that's one of the nice things about having a software program that you can access externally. So salespeople are on the road, they can log in on their phones. If you've given them the right appropriate access level, they can log in. They can see what's in production. They can see what SKUs are there, and you know they can communicate that to their buyers. You know, CO, maybe he or she is on an airplane going somewhere. You know, they're at the airport. They want to check in and see what's been happening. They can do that remotely, and you know the 1960s are over. You know, there's no need for big filing cabinets all the time, and. And really, it is a point for concern, because what happens, you know, if that person, you know, is on vacation when there's a spot audit, the person that you know knows where all the files are stored, can access them quickly. It can be really challenging, and you know, ideally, everyone in the facility knows where all the records are at any one time. But in reality, you know, that's probably not the case, you know, and so if there's a standardized system that everyone has access to, you know, it makes it just that much easier. Yeah,
that's a good point that you mentioned about not always having the physical documentation and having different types of storage, like cloud storage. And Health Canada, you know, I feel like in the very early days, they were very much like, we need printouts, but eventually, you know, they recognize that there are other like secure ways of keeping documents. And really it's a matter of, you know, if you're in a location that you can access it, you don't have internet issues, again, which is something that happens like quite commonly sometimes, is that there's actual issues with you know, internet access or whatever that may be, wireless connection sometimes, and they can't access files, and that could be another cause for a deficiency if you can't actually access the records, knowing that you have the records, but the fact that you can't even access them to show them, then that's still a deficiency. So I guess, having all of the aspects covered, you know, that pertain to the software, whether that's, you know, actually having the software, accessing it, pulling the records, like all of that kind of.
It's true. I mean, some facilities are located, you know, way out there, and you know, internet access, it can be a little bit spotty, and you know, there are ways around that to make sure that, you know, everything's up to date and accessible. But yeah, it can be a consideration for sure. You know, Sherry, people always ask me they say, well, what should we be budgeting for a software program as well? So, you know, we can talk a little bit more, you know, about the risks of failing a Health Canada audit, which I think is very interesting. And then, you know, that kind of speaks to, well, you know, what should we invest, you know, to avoid this happening? Right. So the first question is kind of, you know, what happens if someone fails an audit, or they get these deficiencies?
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit. So after an audit, so Health Canada will be at the site, they'll walk through the facility, they'll review the records, they'll end the audit with an exit interview, or an exit meeting, where essentially they bring everybody back to the boardroom and they'll go over the different deficiencies that they saw at the facility. So it's not really a surprise when Health Canada prepares the report and they send that report to the license holder. You know, at that time, the license holder will know exactly how Health Canada has rated the observations, but they'll know that the deficiency has been noted by the auditor. So when they get the report, they'll say, okay, yeah, we talked about this deficiency, but now I see the impact of that deficiency in terms of how it's rated in the inspection report. Once the license holder gets the inspection report, they'll have 10 business days to prepare a response. And the response should be very clear on how they're going to mitigate the deficiency. So there should be a clear CAPA, so a corrective action and preventative action plan or measures that really outline what they're going to do to address the issue, but also how are they going to prevent it from occurring again in the future. So once that plan is sent to Health Canada, and with all the responses, Health Canada will review it. If they have further questions, then Health Canada will send another report that is outlining, what additional things that they want to see or that they have concerns about. So it's kind of like another report with some, more detail into the observation and what they're looking to be addressed. So the license holder will respond to that, and there may be one of those reports or maybe more depending on the situation. And then when Health Canada is satisfied, they will send the license holder a final monitoring report that kind of concludes the inspection. In some situations, so when the audit is done and you get that the first inspection report, Health Canada will indicate in the report if the overall facility and license holder activities and what they've been doing is compliant or non-compliant with the regulations. So it's really just a holistic look at the regulations and how they've complied with it. And that is reflective of the observations that you've received, and Health Canada will give an overall rating, a compliance rating. So non-compliant or compliant, depending. In a situation where it's non-compliant, it doesn't necessarily mean that the license holder will be impacted by some, increased enforcement action, right? It could just be that, okay, you're non-compliant, but Health Canada has recognized that there could be deficiencies, and you may be on a more frequent inspection schedule. They may come back sooner just to see how you're doing. But in some situations it's not compliant, and it is a very severe issue, right? Like Health Canada is saying, okay, well, there are severe deficiencies in your facility. It may be a situation where Health Canada may have to issue a warning letter, or they may have to mandate a recall or conduct seizures of products at the facility, or they could even administer an administrative policy up to $1 million as a penalty. And then in other cases, a license could be suspended and it could be revoked. So it really kind of goes up in severity of the enforcement action, and that increase depends on what the actual severity of that deficiency was. Health Canada will look at a few things when they're making their decision on enforcement actions. They'll look at what that severity was of the actual occurrence. They'll look at the compliance history of the license holder. They'll look at the behavior of the license holder when they're conducting the audit. Were they resisting? Were they providing misleading information? Were they resisting the auditors? So they'll even look at the behavior, and they'll look at if that issue has been systemic. So has it been occurring over many different instances? Was there an inspection earlier where they had the same issue, and even though they provided some response, the response was never followed through on, and it's kind of occurring as a systemic issue, right? So there's really a lot of factors that go into the decision of enforcement, but Health Canada's immediate response really isn't always to put down the heavy hand, right? They want to work with the license holders. They want to bring them back into compliance. They recognize that there is like an education, like learning curve associated with understanding the regulations. But when you get into any regulated industry, it's the regulated party's responsibility to comply and to learn what they need to do to comply with in the industry, right, that they're working in. So the onus is still on the license holder to comply, and Health Canada recognizes that there may be some learning that they kind of help the license holder through it, but again, they'll look at those other factors and see if a more severe enforcement action is warranted.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And how, when you have an inspection coming up, or you have a Health Canada surprise audit, what's the best way for a facility to work with an auditor to ensure that everything goes smoothly? The auditor doesn't think that they're,
yes,
as you say, resisting or covering anything up,
yeah,
or what if there is a deficiency also that someone finds within the
yeah,
facility? Should they just say, this is an issue right now, we're working on it? What would you suggest?
So always be cooperative with the auditor. Always be willing to provide the information that they request. I would also, kind of say it with a caveat that always be direct on what the response is and what they're asking for. Because I think sometimes that an auditor will ask for a certain thing or a certain document, and the personnel at the facility kind of sometimes gives too much,
Okay.
where it's like starts to create confusion like unnecessarily. And it's not that there was a deficiency, but the way that it's presented, because it's just like, here's everything, and it's just like, and then you kind of start like picking things apart, and then the auditor might think that, okay, people don't have a really good handle on the situation because now that all this data is thrown at me. And it's like, if you can't answer the question specifically and you feel like you have to throw all this data at me, then like maybe you don't know your operations that well. Right? So it's like not intentional, but it could give that impression that that's the case. So I would say be direct on the responses that you're giving the auditor. Make sure that you know your facility really well, and you should, right? Like you should know where to find documents. You should know who has the expertise to respond to a question. The auditor's not always expecting the key people to know all the answers, because they recognize, there are, production staff, there are other quality technicians on the team, there's an IT person that might be managing the software, right? So there are other people that you can lean on in the facility to get the answers that the auditor is looking for. And it's okay to ask others at the facility who would know the answer, right? And I think it's a matter of, like, oh, okay, there's someone else on the team that knows, I'm gonna bring them in and they can answer it. So I think that's important to know. And it's also important to recognize that despite knowing everything at your facility, the auditor will usually find something, and auditors know that people are not perfect, right? And the facility's not perfect, and they're not expecting that, but they want that imperfection to be something that's minor, right? That's not going to impact the health and safety of people and create drug diversion, right? So I think that's just important to recognize as you go into an audit.
Absolutely. And let me ask you, are these audit reports, are they published? Are they accessible by the public, or?
Yeah, great question. The audit reports are not published, but the results of audits, Health Canada presents the data sort of like an inspection summary data that they publish. They publish it yearly, although there's a bit of delay in when it's published. I think the last published data is from 2020 or 2021, so it's not super up to date, but it's a summary of, you'll see the license holder name, you'll see whether they're compliant or non-compliant, and then just what the types of observation ratings were that they got in the audit. So was it minor, or was it minor and major, was it minor, major, critical? So you'll see you won't see the number of observations, but you'll see which types of ratings they got, and then you'll see if they're compliant or non-compliant.
Okay.
And then generally also what the area of concern was that they were.
Very interesting.
So there's some detail there. Yeah.
Okay. And what are the implications? Now you've talked about, potentially getting revoked, getting a fine, but you've mentioned that Health Canada generally wants to work to bring people up to the standard. I mean, they're going to cooperate. But what about other global compliance standards? So if someone is looking to go through get their GACP or GMP, EU GMP, how does their Health Canada audit history impact that, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a good question. On the global front, I mean, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, I would say audits are fair, and even in different industries, audits are fairly standardized in the sense that they are assessing you to an applicable regulation. You are a regulated party, so they're looking at how you comply within that industry. And the audits themselves the format of it is scheduled very similarly. There's also announced, unannounced in other industries as well. And they provide reports with deficiency ratings. So, Health Canada uses minor, major, critical. Some industries use other variations of that, but it's essentially the same. So when a company is looking to explore the viability of going to another international market, and oftentimes they want to go to Australia or Germany or wherever they want to go, they are needing to comply with a quality standard that is GACP, so good agricultural and collection practices, or GMP, good manufacturing practices, depending on if they're a cultivator, GACP, if they're kind of moving to drying, processing kind of areas, then it goes into GMP. And I would say that from working in a regulated industry, at least you have a good foundation, right? You're complying with you're looking at GPP standards, and that is very unique to Canada. There are no other industries that follow GPP. That's something that Health Canada allowed for in Canada, specifically for the cannabis industry, to make it easier to comply with. And it's not directly translatable to other quality standards like GACP or GMP, but there are elements of those other standards that are incorporated into GPP. So there is like some foundation there, and external auditors will, I guess they will consider the fact that you've been audited, and they will be interested in what the observation responses are and what the results are of that, if you were generally complying. But I would say that before you even get to the point where you are engaging an auditor, a foreign auditor, to come in and audit your site for GACP or GMP, that you would make sure that your site complies. So, typically companies will work with a company that could offer services in getting those license holders ready for an inspection, and we do that a lot. We'll help companies from the GACP and GMP readiness side and work with them on how they can create a robust system, and validation, stability testing, and all those elements in GMP and GACP become very important, where it's less so under the Cannabis Act with GPP. So I think that's like a very core distinction of the two. So there is some readiness that needs to happen before those audits, those external audits, and certification readiness is at a point where it's suitable. And I guess on that, a large portion of that too is, how are you going to keep the records to be compliant with, external, foreign, I guess, jurisdiction compliance? And how would you say that there is that difference? How does it comply with meeting those different quality standards?
Yeah, it's a good question from a record-keeping point of view. I mean, we're often approached by groups who are going through that validation, or that's their end game, and they want to know how software can help them with that and get them to that finish line. And really, I mean, the software, it's not a turnkey solution. I mean, it would be great if it were, but it would make life a lot easier. But unfortunately, it's really, you have to look at the facility in a holistic way, and work with the quality team, and software is part of that, GACP, GMP roadmap, but it's not the only thing that's needed. And really, again, it comes back to a discussion with the quality team in terms of what records they're using from the software, what specifically they want to rely on. I mean, are they relying on signatures, digital signatures from the software, or are they using handwritten signatures after they print something off? And that changes some of the dynamic in terms of what's needed, what's not. A lot of groups are looking at Europe these days, and so EU GMP validation is something that they're looking at for the facility, and one of the aspects of that is the UDRLX Volume 4 Annex 11 on computerized systems, which touches on aspects around security, different authorization and permissions, who can release a batch, or record the paperwork for releasing a batch, and when you're looking at different software programs, you want to make sure that those controls and authorizations are in place, at least for certain of these critical activities. And software companies that you're working with, they can help you identify what some of those critical points are if the quality team isn't totally sure themselves. Typically, the software company will have dealt with this before and can identify a few key areas they might want to look at. Can provide validation documents or other documentation to the quality team that won't replace the quality team's work for that facility, unfortunately, but it can help them along that path and kind of direct them to the right areas and the right point.
Yeah, the quality team is extremely important when when looking to initiate activities in international markets and engaging in GMP and going down that roadmap, as you were saying, to get to that point. And it's always good, when you start a business, to be able to have the foresight. That's not always the case, of course, of how you want to diversify your portfolio. And you might think, okay, I only want to be in Canada, but then you realize that there's a lot of opportunity in international markets. And in the Canadian industry, and with a lot of clients that we have, they are really starting to look to international markets to see what other opportunities are there, especially as we see in the States that there are many states legalizing, right? And people are going in that direction. So when thinking about a software, right out the gate, and you want it to be as, I guess, versatile as possible, so you can, pivot if needed, what are some aspects that companies should consider when they're looking to purchase the software?
Yeah, very, very good question. And I think you touched on a good portion of that earlier when you were talking about, where they want to be in the future. And you're right. I mean, a lot of the times business cases change and directions pivot, but that's something I think a company wants to do, is consider, really what their company needs are, which sounds basic, but I mean, in terms of language, in terms of what their staffing is. So if you're in Montreal or somewhere else in Quebec, maybe you need French language access. What kind of staff do you have there? Are they, do you have a big team? Do you want everybody to have access to the software? Do you want it, is it a smaller team where it's going to be kind of a focused access point that you have? What's your quality system like? Is it all on paper now? Do you want to move it onto a digital system? So all these considerations are there. And finally, the other thing is, as you were saying, where do you want to be as a company, right? Do you want to go for that GACP? Do you want to move to EU GMP in the future? And, even if it's a year or two down the road, these are some things you might want to consider when you're selecting a program, because you don't want to bring in a program and then have to switch it out another 2 years later when you find it doesn't meet your requirements. The other thing I'd suggest companies look at is, one, where is the company doing business? Are they doing business internationally in different jurisdictions? If, again, those are export-focused markets for you, that is probably a good group to work with, because not only will they understand the regulations there, but they may also know a lot of groups there that you can communicate through that. And the other point I want to touch on is functionality. So there are a lot of great programs out there that are stronger or weaker in certain areas. And if you're a cultivation only facility, it doesn't really make sense to focus on software that's very strong in processing. At the same time, if you're a cultivation facility and one day you might want to get into processing, it would be good if there's a module or a capability for that you can, so that you can add that on or move through without having to do a whole rip and replace of your ERP system, because it's not impossible, but it's another project. It takes time, and everybody's busy. So.
Yeah, I can say as a business owner, I try to use the crystal ball as much as possible. It doesn't always work out that way, but good to have the foresight. So I know that you're in 15 countries. What does that mean for the customization of the software? Is this something that you offer different packages, or is there an element of customizability that can be done depending, by the actual license holder or business owner themselves?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a bit of both. So we do have some flexibility depending on jurisdictional preferences. So exactly as you're saying. The other piece, though, we try to do, and I was mentioning it earlier, was even within one jurisdiction, methodologies differ between companies. So we try to add a fair bit of flexibility in there so that different facilities can use the software as they want to. If they want to change their processes, the software program isn't preventing them from doing so. They can pivot very quickly within the software program. Yeah, but one of the nice things about being in all these different countries is that we get exposure to different industry best practices. And in Europe, they coming from a pharma, really pharma-led quality approach out there. There are specific concerns that they have in certain markets that we can get incorporated, and for the benefit of groups in other countries, Canada has a very advanced industry, and so a lot of the innovations that have occurred here are automatically available to groups in.
Well, that's nice to hear, because I don't think we always feel that way. So okay, yeah, that's awesome. And then by you kind of directly or indirectly start to learn those best practices in other jurisdictions, right? Because if you're using the software, then you might not even realize that you're even increasing your knowledge base and the best practices that just by using the software. So that's a great advantage. Exactly. What would you say is the return on investment of purchasing a software?
Very, very good question. Again, a lot of it depends on the company itself and the efficiencies that they have in there. But I'll start out with the cost side of it. And across the industry, there's just so much variability in terms of what a company would look at. So there's free software out there that you can download off the internet, which in the end will probably cost you more than a software that you pay for, and it'll scale up from there. So it could be, you could be looking at groups between $500 and $1,000 a month for, a micro facility. For larger facilities, some groups will charge, $10,000 a month to implement it. Then there are some, very large systems that, are pushing into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for an initial implementation. So it depends on the system that you select, and what functionalities you need and the size of facility you have. Some companies will base it on user. Others will base it on some other methodology. But the ROI is the other piece. So what's the savings, right, that you get out of it? So one, it's risk reduction. So healthcare audit, Health Canada audit comes in, and you can be confident that you're ready to go, right? And so elimination of risk is a big aspect of it. And then efficiency is driven by, transparency, so your sales team can more efficiently match what you have in your inventory to what they're selling while they're down at a customer site. And then finally, a really big one is just time savings in record keeping. So, we're talking, weeks for certain activities that can be saved. Especially around inventory handling and batch record preparation. This is hours a day for different staff members at the facility. So it's a lot of savings in terms of personnel. You're not having to add bodies. You get more efficiency, more transparency out of it, which is ultimately a win. And then finally there's the morale aspect. If you're swimming in paperwork, no one's going to look forward to Monday morning when that's the case. So cleaning things up, modernizing a little bit is really a nice approach for everybody working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great benefits. Yeah, I could see the direct ROI on that. Who would you say are the typical users then of the platform?
Yeah, very good question. So there are a few distinct groups, really. So you have the cultivation team is one, the processing team is another, and they both have very unique and specific needs while they're using a platform. Quality team is another, and then the commercial team is the last group, I would say. And commercial team being those that are handling sales and shipping and that sort of thing. And we can even lump in here, CFOs, CEOs who are looking to pull data on, inventory and costing, activities within the facility. It really speaks to what their role is in terms of the driving profitability for the company. So yeah, those four main groups tend to be the different users, and they have different desires and needs in a software program. So some of them will have a preference one way, some of them may have a preference another way, and really key to a good software program is being able to meet those.
Yeah, I would imagine then that depending on, because you're saying that there's different roles that would be using the software and they have different responsibilities and interests, I guess, out of what the data outcomes would be. So I would imagine that there would be variations in the authorizations and accessibility for accessing key parts of the software, and then the other part of it is the reporting. And is there customizability in the reports and dashboards that you could create in the software?
100%. So not every software program does it, but some of the more popular programs are developing this way to meet industry needs. So yeah, you can mix and match what your reports look like, what your inputs are, what your outputs are. Really, the industry has reached a sophistication level where people do want to see that out of their software programs,
right, yeah.
And it's we do need to support all the team members with the information they need to go do their reporting and push that efficiency within the business. So yeah, it is our platform GrowerIQ is the reports are very customizable, and within the industry I think you have various levels of that with other programs.
And how well would you say that these types of record keeping softwares integrate well with other common softwares like QuickBooks or a CRM or others?
Yeah, no, really good question, because seed to sale platform, cannabis production platform, I mean it's one part of a business ecosystem, and HR system, like you say, QuickBooks, they may want to, if they're doing medical sales, they may want to integrate with an online portal. So yeah, all these platforms really should be able to open up and integrate with these other pieces. Some do, some don't. A lot of the time it depends on what the integration need is. But typically I would say, as an IT strategy for a cannabis company that's starting up, a good approach is start with a seed to sale cannabis software, and then build around it. And you can build all the way up to SAP or Sage. I mean, those are fantastic programs, but for a company just kicking off right out of the gate, might be a little more than is necessary right away, and you can step up to that approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good recommendation, is planning out the IT, like the infrastructure, which doesn't always work out that way, right?
No,
and especially if you started off with paper and then you have all these other systems, and then you're trying to figure out which record keeping system would work well for your facility. But yeah, I guess that's a good comment, that if you have the ability to do so, plan the IT.
So it goes back to the crystal ball.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If we find one that works, yeah. It'll be good.
So Rob, that's great. Thank you so much for being here today and providing all of your amazing insight. I think that I've learned a lot, and hopefully you've learned something from me as well, and that the audience has learned a lot from us. If there are any other questions or insights or comments or support that anyone in the audience is looking for, we'd be more than happy to provide some feedback and get in touch with us. So thank you again, Rob.
Sherry, thank you so much for having me. As Sherry says, more than happy to answer any questions, comments. Please feel free to reach out anytime, and I'll hope to hear from you.
Take care.
Bye.